Watercolor. I'm Wendy here at Pepper Gettings with the City of Myrtle Beach. This is a layered watercolor flower lesson today. So if you've been following along, this is part 3 of our series. The first lesson I talked about shading, learning how to take one color going from the darkest hue to the very lightest. The lesson 2, I discussed mark making, how to use different types of brushes, creating different marks. And with today's lesson, the layered watercolor flowers, we're going to be combining those 2 lessons to create a painting. All right, so today to get started, you will need a few things. First of all, I took a ruler and pencil and just divided my paper into quarters. That way I will be able to do 4 different types of flowers. Secondly, a paint palette. And if you'll notice, I know mine looks dirty. However, it really isn't. One of the great things about using watercolor is that you can reactivate it. So these are the colors that I mixed up to create this example for you. So I will just simply have to add a little bit of water, a little more paint to this to reactivate the paint. Second, you'll need a test strip. If you'll remember in a former lesson, before you put it down on the paper, this is a good way to test out your color. And then 2 cups of clean water. One will be used to clean the brush. The second one will be used to pour into the paint for creating our different shades. And then for today, I will be using 2 brushes, a very fine tip that will be used for line making, and then a rounder, broader tip that will be used for creating the flower petals. Okay. Paper towel, just in case, to blot off the excess paint and water. So we're ready to get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is get my paint palette ready. And as you can see here, there's a little bit of green left in the palette, so I'm going to add a little bit of water. Okay. To reactivate. And this is not going to be dark enough, so I will have to add some more paint. And I'm just using the paintbrush itself to mix the paint with the water. And for this shade of green, I use sap green. And if you'll remember, watercolor paint is super concentrated, so a little bit really does go a long way. Okay, blot off a little of the excess, and then I'm going to test it out on my test strip here to make sure I'm happy with the color, and I am. So I'm going to begin by creating a couple of stems. And I want to make sure I leave room to create the flower petals. Let's see, I'll have one going that way and maybe the other one crossing over and down. And remember, you don't have to be too precise. That gives it a more natural effect. Now, an important thing to remember when using your watercolor paint is to allow time for it to dry. So I'm going to leave these stems alone for now and go back and add to it later. Another helpful tip is also you can use a blow dryer to help speed along the drying process. So if I were ready to add details to this stem, I would go ahead and dry it. But at this point, I want to move on to the flower petals. And for my first flower, I did not have any pink. And this is where color mixing, perhaps we'll cover this in a future lesson, comes in handy. So to create a shade of pink, I took some crimson red and mixed in a little bit of white to create this pink color. Let's go ahead and reactivate it with just a little bit of water. And this time I'm going to use my round brush. Okay, and I'm going to just start dabbing in some paint, and you can see here how it comes back to life, if you will. Add a little bit more paint, or water rather, and that just might be enough here. So let's test it out on our strip. And as you can see, it's a nice shade of pink. So I'm gonna go ahead and go with that. So for layering, what I'm going to do is start with my darkest hue. So I'm going to create a petal at the edge of one of the stems. And I'm going to start at the top, and remember to get a nice even stroke, you want to keep that brush moving. So I'm just going to paint down, and then I've got a little puddle here, so I'm going to use that to my advantage and just work with the puddle to try to move it around and cover this area evenly. Might be a little too much water, so what I can do here is remove some of the excess with the brush, almost like a mop. Okay, and I'm pretty satisfied with that first petal. I'm going to move on to the next petal. And remember to avoid bleeding. You'll want to leave a little bit of space between. So I'm going to create another petal off to the side and start at the top. Just kind of get that outline first. Try to keep my brush moving. This is where that mark making exercise really can be useful. Okay. And it's okay to have a little variation in the tones. So I'm happy with that, and let's add one more off to this side. And this is a wet on dry technique. So this paper is dry, the paint is wet. So let's give that some time here to dry. I'm just going to spread that out a little bit more. Maybe remove some of that excess. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to use my hair dryer to speed it up, maybe on low. We created our darker petals for our first flower. Let's go ahead and do it for flower 2. Now this one I want to create more of a bud type effect. So I'm going to keep the petals closer together. And I am going to actually just do one petal that is darker right in the center. And what I'm learning with watercolor paint and using this type of medium, it really is a process. Making sure I do each section, if you will, step by step. Okay, and making sure I give time for that first layer to dry. I'm going to use my blow dryer again. So there we have it. Our first layer is done. Now to create that layering effect, this is where I need to apply a little more water to this shade of pink. So actually I'm just going to dab my paintbrush because I want to be very careful here. I don't go crazy with it because if I add too much, it'll just become too watery and too translucent. Let's get that stirred up pretty well. And again, I have my test strip here. I'm going to use that to make sure. Still looks a little dark, so I'm going to add yet a little more water. Now see where we're at. Oh, a little bit more. There we go. So now I'm ready to layer. Okay. So what I'm going to make sure I accomplish here is that I overlap. So I'm going to add petals right between, I think I'm going to do 2. One right between these 2 darker petals and then one on the other side. So let's make sure they overlap. And once this dries, you'll really get a better sense of how this is going to look. Again, you can remove some of that excess here with your brush. I just think this turns out really nice. Let's do the other one. This one we can do even lighter. Okay, and then let's do our bud on this side. I'm going to do again one on each side of the darker petal. Remove any excess. And there we go. So now we'll just, while that's drying, we'll go ahead and do some layering to add some leaves to these stems. So for this, I'm going to clean my brush with my dirty water. And just know you should avoid pressing down on your bristles. This will really help prolong the life of your paint brushes if you avoid doing that. And just kind of move your paintbrush around to clean it in a figure 8 pattern. Then you can blot it and it should be clean. So that's a helpful tip for cleaning your brushes when moving to one color to the next. So let's go ahead and add a few leaves to our stems. Right, so I'm going to, again, it doesn't have to be perfect. So to create a turn down leaf effect, I start with one leaf out in one direction, and then I'm going to have another leaf kind of going in a downward fashion to give it a turn down effect here. And I kind of like how it's darker in some areas and lighter in the others, so I'm just going to leave that alone. Okay, so there's our first leaf. And then let's just add a smaller leaf to this side. Okay, and we're going to speed this over. This one's kind of blobbing here. Let's get rid of some of that paint. There we go. Right, now let's speed up the drying process. That's our first flower. I hope that really gives you a good idea. So next I'm going to move on to more of like a pansy, and for this one I'm going to be using yellow and a darker shade of green, which I did use for this example here. Okay, so we're going to reactivate what's left of that paint by adding just a little bit of water. Where did my, there we go. It's the nice thing about watercolor. You can really make it go a long way here. Okay, so let's test it out. Make sure that resembles some, oh yeah, that's a nice dark green. So I'm going to go with that for one stem, and I'm just going to make one here to demonstrate. Remember, these fine brushes really do a nice job for stem, making grass. And let's go ahead and add a couple of leaves. Again, you don't have to be perfect. It's a little bit more challenging with the fine brush, but I'm making them small, so it'll be fine. This one, I'm just going to keep this a little lighter, and then let's give it a turn down effect. Smooth it out a little bit. There we go. So there we have our stem. And I'm going to keep this paintbrush handy for when I create the middle of our flower. I'll go back to that green. Let's reactivate the yellow. And I might have to mix up some more, we'll see. Now my kit came with these very basic colors. So just remember, you can mix some of the colors together to create new ones. That's a fun exercise in itself. So let's see how this yellow turns out. Yeah, I think that'll work. I might have to add just a little bit more. There we go. That should be enough. Once again, we'll give it a test. And that brightened it up a little bit. So let's go with that. So again, to create that layering effect, remember the first thing you want to do is your darkest, because you can always add more water to your paint to make it lighter. So these I'm keeping kind of wide on the outside and going kind of narrow to the inside. Try to smooth it out. Remember, use your paintbrush as kind of your mop if you get a little too much on there. There we go. And then I'm going to do 3 more. This one turned out a nice golden color. Okay, and then we'll dry it before we layer with a lighter shade. Batten down the hatches here. Now we're ready to create the lighter petals with that layering effect. So I'm going to need to add a little more water to the yellow to create that lighter shade. Just a lot of experimentation with watercolor. Maybe a little bit more. I think for me that's the most challenging, is mixing it, and there we go. I think I'm happy with that. All right, so now I'm ready to layer. So I'm going to go right in between those darker petals and make sure that they overlap. There we are, and give that a little time to dry here. We'll speed it up. I'm ready to go back and add my center. Once again, I'm going to use that green that I used for the stem and the petals, and just using the very tip of my fine line brush. Just make little tiny dots. And there you have it. So moving on, you can try this with other shades. What I did here is a combination of orange with just a hint of white to create this flower. This one I wanted to show you what not to do. I became impatient. I did not allow enough time for those first darker petals to dry before I created the lighter shade. And as you can see, it ran a little bit. It's just kind of fuzzy looking. It really doesn't have that same layered effect as the others. So I hope you will give this a try. Please share your results with me, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.